A single, flawless silver blade reflects the burning ruins of a shattered galaxy. To understand the nightmare of the Dark Millennium, we must look beyond the endless blood and the bitter betrayal to the profound tragedy of a being engineered to be utterly without flaw. This is the complete story of Fulgrim, how the most perfect son of the Emperor fell the furthest of all his brothers. Before he was a serpentine monster, he was a martial masterpiece. Before the galaxy burned in the fires of civil war, it marveled at his unmatched grace. But who was this being, and how did a creature born of pure, golden ambition descend into the darkest abysses of sensory depravity? The answer begins long before the Great Crusade reached out to reclaim the stars. Deep beneath the irradiated crust of terror, the master of mankind labored in absolute secrecy. He was forging the Primarchs, 20 genetically engineered demigods, immortal sons designed to lead humanity's vast armies and conquer the cosmos. They were to be the Emperor's generals, his peerless avatars of war, each crafted from his own genetic template to embody a specific aspect of his unimaginable might and intellect. Yet the Emperor's grand design was violently interrupted before it could truly begin. A cataclysmic incursion of warp-born power struck the subterranean gene labs. Ruinous, otherworldly energies tore through the esoteric wards of the Imperial dungeon, creating a howling vortex of warp-spawned malice. The heavily shielded gestation capsules, each containing a slumbering infant Primarch, were ripped from their foundational cradles. In a catastrophic instant, the infant Primarchs were scattered from the Emperor's gene labs across the galaxy, violently cast into the unforgiving void and lost to their creator's sight. One of those capsules, a pod of gleaming metal and arcane life support systems, tumbled through the turbulent, maddening currents of the immaterium. Inside rested a child of unparalleled potential, his genetic structure woven with an inherent drive for transcendent beauty and absolute mastery. Eventually, this capsule was violently expelled from the warp, plummeting like a dying star toward an isolated, decaying realm. Fulgrim's capsule came to the world of Chemos. Chemos was not a world of glory, art, or light. It was a bleak, exhausted sphere, its atmosphere permanently choked with caustic smog and its surface scarred by millennia of relentless industrial decay. To this dying, lightless rock came the infant who would one day command the Emperor's most elite legion. For a newcomer to the grim darkness of the far future, the tale of a Primarch is often one of brutal planetary conquest or savage wilderness survival. But Fulgrim's genesis on this desolate planet is fundamentally a story of obsession. He was a being who would look upon a broken, imperfect universe and decide with absolute certainty that he alone possessed the vision to fix it. He would demand absolute flawlessness from himself, from his genetically forged sons, and from the galaxy itself. That relentless pursuit of an unattainable ideal would become his greatest weapon in the wars to come. And, inevitably, it would become the very instrument of his damnation. The perfect son was destined to become the ultimate corruption, a tragic testament to the dangers of unyielding pride. The glowing crater left by the capsule's violent atmospheric entry was a brief, anomalous beacon on a world long accustomed to shadows. As the dust settled across the ash-choked plains, the infant Primarch took his first breaths of a poisoned atmosphere. This was Chemos, the world that had caught a falling sun of terror. But to truly comprehend the crucible that forged this demigod, we must understand the sheer, suffocating desperation of his new home. Chemos was an isolated graveyard of ambition. It was a once rich mining world whose slowly starving population toiled in giant fortress factories. Millennia ago, during a forgotten golden age of human expansion, it had been a crown jewel of resource extraction. Now, it was a necrotic husk, cut off from the wider galaxy by warp storms and drained of its natural wealth. The sky was a perpetual bruised twilight of industrial smog. The surface was an irradiated wasteland, entirely hostile to unaugmented human life. Survival was only possible behind the monolithic plasteel walls of colossal industrial settlements. These were not cities in any traditional sense, but vast utilitarian engines of survival where millions lived and died without ever seeing the sun. It was into this bleak mechanical purgatory that the glowing child was delivered. A scouting party out of Calax, braving the toxic ash wastes, discovered the smoking crater. Within the ruined esoteric machinery of the gestation pod, their captain found a creature of impossible vitality. Against the grim custom of Chemos, where foundlings were one more mouth the quotas could not feed, the captain of the Calax scouts petitioned the executives for the right to adopt the child and won. A Primarch's arrival might conjure images of immediate reverence and royal upbringing. On Chemos, there was no room for gods, only quotas. Calax was a grim, grinding monument to bare existence. Its towering exhaust stacks vented toxic heat into the atmosphere, while deep within its subterranean levels, a desperate populace labored endlessly to maintain the failing atmospheric scrubbers and synthetic nutrient processors. Every calorie was rationed, every drop of purified water was accounted for. The child was not worshipped, and childhood brought no mercy from the quotas. Fulgrim was pulling the shift norm of a grown labourer at half the age Calax usually sent its children to the lines. Yet a being engineered by the master of mankind cannot be suppressed by mere circumstance. Fulgrim began his life as a simple labourer, his small hands assigned to the relentless, soul-crushing maintenance of failing manufactorum lines. But his biology was a masterpiece of genetic alchemy. He grew at a terrifying superhuman rate, both in physical stature and intellectual processing power. Where the slowly starving population of Calax saw only inevitable decline, the young Primarch saw inefficiency. He saw equations that could be balanced, machinery that could be optimized, and a dying society that could be saved. His mind was a flawless cogitator, absorbing the complex engineering schematics and administrative logistics of the fortress factory with terrifying speed. He did not merely adapt to the brutal rhythm of Calax, he mastered it. He began to improve the failing mechanisms of the water purifiers. He streamlined the labor shifts, maximizing output while minimizing the caloric expenditure of the starving workers. His inherent drive for flawlessness, the very trait that would later define his legion's creed, was first unleashed upon the rusted gears of a dying mining world. His ascent through the rigid utilitarian hierarchy of the settlement was meteoric. He possessed an undeniable magnetic charisma, a radiant aura of perfection that drew the exhausted laborers to him. By his 15th Terran year, the boy who had begun on the labor lines sat among the executives who governed Calax. This was a staggering achievement. The Executive Council of Calax was a cabal of hardened, pragmatic administrators who ruled over life and death with cold, mathematical detachment. For a youth of barely 15 standard years to elevate himself to their ranks spoke of an intellect and a will that bordered on the divine. As an executive, Fulgrim now possessed the authority to enact his grand vision. He looked upon the decaying, starving fortress factory not as a tomb, but as a canvas. The boy who had fallen from the stars was preparing to reforge a world. As an executive of Calax, the young demigod now possessed the institutional leverage to apply his superhuman genius on a planetary scale. The rigid mathematical pragmatism that had long governed the failing fortress factory was about to be shattered by an intellect engineered for cosmic conquest. Fulgrim did not conquer his homeworld with the sword, he conquered it with logistics. The grim economics of the fortress factories had been a brutal, zero-sum game of managed decline. A slow, generational suffocation where every single calorie was weighed against the agonizing output of the smelters. Fulgrim changed the fundamental equation of survival. His redesigned extractors and rebalanced logistics drove production upward. Until, for the first time in decades, the mines of Chemos ran at a surplus, and that surplus bought food from the holds of passing interstellar traders. This single monumental shift cannot be overstated. The mechanics of this recovery are a profound testament to his inherent Primarch nature. He re-engineered the deep core extractors, optimized the orbital transit vectors, and eliminated the frictional losses in the subterranean pipelines. The fortress factories, once little more than sprawling tombs for a starving underclass, were transformed into roaring engines of unprecedented output. The surplus minerals, refined to exact, flawless tolerances, became a highly sought-after currency that caught the attention of passing void caravans. For the first time in living memory, massive nutrient shipments descended through the bruised, smog-choked skies. The slow, agonizing starvation of Chemos was halted by the sheer application of perfect efficiency. With the ever-present spectre of famine finally banished, the psychological yoke upon the populace was lifted. Humanity requires more than mere caloric intake and breathable air to truly thrive. It requires a soul. Now the acknowledged master of his world, Fulgrim turned its new wealth towards something Chemos had long been too starved to afford, its own art and culture. This was the true dawn of the Illuminator. To the millions of citizens who had known only the grinding, deafening gears of Kallax, Fulgrim was a savior who had delivered them from a slow death. He decreed that the pursuit of beauty was no longer a frivolous waste of energy, but rather the highest calling of a saved civilization. Sculptors, musicians, and philosophers emerged from the soot-stained masses. The bleak, monolithic plasteel corridors of the fortress factories were adorned with sweeping murals and illuminated with complex poetry. Here lies the root of the creed that would one day define an entire legion. On Chemos, perfection was not born of arrogance, it was born of absolute unforgivingness. A flawed atmospheric scrubber meant suffocation, an inefficient mining drill meant starvation. Perfection was salvation. When Fulgrim demanded absolute flawlessness in all things, he was not being pedantic. He was demanding the very standard that had rescued his people from the abyssal depths of extinction. To tolerate a flaw was to invite death. As his unquestioned dominion over the revived world solidified, so too did his regal bearing. The soot-covered labourer was gone, replaced by a sovereign of unmatched majesty. He armoured himself in master-crafted artificer plate, wrought in deep purple and traced with radiant gold. This magnificent armour was not merely protective war gear, it was a physical manifestation of his philosophy, a masterwork of metallurgy and aesthetics. His piercing eyes and flowing mane of silvery white hair framed a visage of unearthly, transcendent beauty. When he walked among his people, gleaming in purple and gold, he was the living embodiment of their renaissance. Yet within this golden age of Chemos, the seeds of future ruin were quietly being sown, and Fulgrim believed his own legend. Vainglory came easily to a saviour, and his pride grew with every hymn sung in his honour. He had looked upon a dying world, applied the sheer force of his will, and forced it to live again. He had proven that his vision was utterly flawless. He had saved his people, elevated their souls, and draped them in the finery of a reborn culture. He was the absolute master of his domain, a god walking among mortals who offered him their undivided adoration. Chemos had been transformed from a necrotic husk into a radiant jewel of the void. The colossal fortress factories hummed with harmonious, synchronized industry, and the previously empty skies above were pierced by the colossal cargo ships of eager interstellar traders. Fulgrim had achieved the impossible, forging a utopia from the ashes of a poisoned wasteland. But a Primarch was not made to rule a single world. The galaxy awaited, and with it, the true architect of his creation. The bruised skies of Chemos had long served as an impenetrable vault, sealing the world away from the wider galaxy. Throughout the terrible millenniums of the Age of Strife, fierce warp storms and a dense nebular dust cloud had locked the planet in a perpetual, suffocating grey twilight. Within this bleak isolation, Fulgrim had performed his miracles, transforming a resource-exhausted mining world where all art and leisure had once been brutally sacrificed for mere survival into a thriving, cultured utopia. Yet just as the last remnants of planetary decay were swept away by his sweeping reforms, the heavens themselves parted. The isolation of Chemos was broken not by a catastrophe, but by a revelation of staggering scale. From the swirling atmospheric dust, massive battle-scarred dropships bearing the imperious heraldry of the double-headed eagle descended from the grey sky. The sudden arrival of such overwhelming martial might could easily have sparked panic on a world that possessed no formal army. Under Fulgrim's rule, the planet had known only the caretaker police force to maintain internal order and enforce the strict quotas of the past. Faced with the descent of these unknown, heavily armed titans, a lesser ruler might have ordered a futile defense. Instead, Fulgrim sensed a profound, resonant truth approaching from the stars. He commanded the caretakers to stand down immediately, instructing them to open the great gates of Kallax and welcome the visitors with the dignity fitting a reborn civilization. The visitors marched into the fortress factory, a procession of armored warriors radiating a majesty that eclipsed even the newfound artistic splendor of Chemos. Their footfalls echoed through the plasteel corridors like the beating of a galactic heart, leading directly to the heart of the planetary government. The Emperor of Humanity entered the Spartan quarters of Kallax, a space that still reflected the austere, practical origins of its ruler, despite the sweeping planetary renaissance blooming outside its walls. As the Emperor stepped forward from amidst his armored warriors, the air grew heavy with an immense golden psychic weight. Fulgrim, a being who had spent his life rising from a lowly factory worker to the sole, unquestioned ruler of the planet within 50 years, stood face to face with his creator. For a long moment, the Primarch simply surveyed the radiant figure before him. Here was a being whose sheer presence answered every unspoken question that had haunted Fulgrim since his incubation pod first crashed upon the chemical wastes. The profound drive for perfection, the innate need to elevate humanity from the brink of extinction, the restless, burning intellect that could not be satisfied by the borders of a single world, all of it suddenly made perfect sense. He was not merely a savior of Chemos. He was a weapon forged for the salvation of the human species. Without uttering a single word, Fulgrim dropped to his knees. The sovereign who had conquered a planet bowed his head, drew his sword, and offered it hilt first to the master of mankind. It was an act of complete, unhesitating submission, swearing from that day forward to serve the Imperium with all his heart. The Emperor had rediscovered his lost son on Chemos, and the reunion was absolute in its certainty. Fulgrim formally swore himself to his father's Great Crusade, binding his destiny to the monumental task of reuniting the scattered remnants of humanity. The culture of art, philosophy, and aesthetic beauty that Fulgrim had so painstakingly cultivated was no longer an end in itself. It was now the philosophical foundation he would bring to the stars. The restoration of his homeworld had merely been a trial run, a crucible in which his unparalleled administrative and martial capacities were tested and proven. Now, the true work would begin. The Primarch saw the Great Crusade not merely as a military conquest, but as the ultimate pursuit of perfection on a galactic scale. If one world could be dragged from the abyss of starvation and ignorance into a golden age of enlightenment, then 1,000,000 worlds could be saved in the exact same manner. Fulgrim rose from his knees not just as the master of Chemos, but as a commander of the Imperium, eager to cast his illuminating light across the darkest reaches of the void. His devotion to the Emperor was absolute, born of the sudden, overwhelming realization that he was part of a grand design, a flawless vision for the future of mankind. When Fulgrim rose from the stone floor of his Spartan quarters in Kallax, his absolute submission to the master of mankind sealed a new destiny. The Emperor's arrival on the dreary, isolated world of Chemos had brought more than just the revelation of the Primarch's origins. It brought the promise of a vast transhuman army born of his own genetic material. To be a Primarch was to be a gene sire, the living template for a Space Marine Legion. These legions were the primary instruments of the Great Crusade, immense hosts of genetically augmented warriors designed to conquer the galaxy and reunite the scattered remnants of humanity. Fulgrim, having transformed a dying planet into a beacon of culture and survival, anticipated commanding a sprawling armada of such warriors. He envisioned millions of flawless suns ready to cast the light of enlightenment across the stars. The reality awaiting him on Terra was a stark, sobering contrast. The Iterator Legion possessed a proud and ancient lineage. Its earliest recruits had been drawn from the finest youths of Terra's noble houses of Europa. These proud scions had been surrendered to the Emperor as tribute following their fierce resistance and ultimate defeat during the Unification Wars. It was whispered in the high courts of Terra that this noble origin was the original source of the moniker Emperor's Children, a title born of aristocratic blood and martial pride. Yet by the time Fulgrim was finally brought to the throne world to take his rightful place at their head, the martial glory of the Iterator Legion had been reduced to a fragile ember. When Fulgrim was placed at the head of his legion, he did not look out upon a sea of thousands. He addressed a mere 200 space marines. The gathering was a solemn assembly of survivors. Each of the 200 warriors stood resolute, bearing the heavy, tattered banners of dead or drastically dwindled companies. For a being obsessed with perfection and grand designs, inheriting a military force on the brink of extinction could have been a crushing disappointment. Instead, Fulgrim saw an unpolished gemstone, a flawless core from which a new legacy would be cut. He addressed his shockingly small host with a conviction that resonated with the very soul of the Great Crusade. He spoke not of their diminished numbers, but of their immense purpose. Fulgrim told his 200 sons that they would carry the Emperor's wisdom into the darkest corners of the galaxy. Drawing upon the profound philosophical doctrines that had saved his homeworld, he declared their shared destiny. He proclaimed to them that they were his children, adding, "Only by imperfection can we fail him, we will not fail." These words, echoing with absolute loyalty and an unyielding drive for excellence, struck a profound chord. The Emperor, witnessing this exchange between the newly recovered gene sire and his embattled progeny, was deeply moved by the Primarch's devotion. In a galaxy where transhuman warriors were often viewed merely as weapons of conquest, Fulgrim had elevated them to the purest expression of the Imperial ideal. In recognition of this flawless spirit, the Master of Mankind formally reaffirmed their title. The Iterator Legion would be known forevermore as the Emperor's Children. Furthermore, they were granted an unparalleled honor. They became the only first founding legion permitted to bear the Emperor's own name, a name that now crowned the Palatine Aquila they already carried. The personal sigil of the Master of Mankind blazoned upon their chests, an honor bought in blood long before the Blight ever struck. Despite the unmatched prestige of their new title and heraldry, the practical realities of the Great Crusade could not be ignored. 200 warriors, no matter how perfectly disciplined or exquisitely armed, were simply far too few to crusade alone in a hostile galaxy. A legion of such microscopic size would be annihilated in a single major planetary compliance. To ensure their survival and growth, the Emperor made a strategic decision that would shape the future of the Imperium in ways no one could foresee. He placed the Emperor's children under the direct command of another Primarch, Horus, and his formidable lunar wolves. Rather than feeling slighted by this subordination, Fulgrim embraced the opportunity to learn the art of galactic warfare alongside his brother. The two legions fought shoulder to shoulder for almost a century. Through countless campaigns and brutal compliances, the Emperor's children and the lunar wolves shed blood together across the stars. This prolonged period of shared martial endeavor forged a deeply intimate, unbreakable bond between Fulgrim and Horus, a brotherhood cemented in the fires of war that would endure until Horus's eventual promotion to War Master after the Illuminator Crusade. The Iterator Legion had survived its darkest hour, preserved by the grace of the Emperor and the tutelage of his most favored son, ready at last to pursue perfection across the void. The pursuit of perfection across the void alongside the lunar wolves was a necessity born of profound tragedy. To understand why Fulgrim's host required the protection and tutelage of a brother Primarch, one must examine the creeping catastrophe that had reduced the Third Legion to a mere 200 warriors. The Emperor's children had not always been a dying breed. In the earliest days of the Great Crusade, their ranks had been filled with the aristocratic youth of Europa, and their future seemed as boundless as any of their brother legions. Yet, a shadow fell over their genetic legacy, systematically strangling their numbers long before their Primarch was ever found on the grey world of Chemos. The foundation of any Space Marine Legion is its gene seed, the biological heritage that allows for the creation of new transhuman warriors. For the Third Legion, this precious resource was subjected to a sequence of devastating, inexplicable losses. Within a year of the compliance of Proxima, a substantial portion of the Legion's gene seed reserve was lost in transit to Luna. While Imperial records simply noted the shipment as vanished in the treacherous currents of the void, esoteric accounts suggest a far stranger fate. It is whispered in hidden archives that the stock was pilfered by the ancient Xenos collector known as Trazyn the Infinite. Regardless of the culprit, this disappearance was a severe blow to the Legion's expansion, but it was not the killing strike. The true annihilation of the Legion's future came from within the Sol system itself, born of ancient spite. The Selenar gene cults of Luna had been brought to heel during the pacification of Luna. Forced by Blood and Bolter to yield their unparalleled mastery of genetics to the Emperor's Great Crusade. However, submission did not equate to loyalty. In the shadows, a treacherous Selenite plot took root, targeting the Third Legion's remaining gene seed stock held in the heavily guarded vaults on Terra. The cultists introduced a targeted, fast-acting viral infection into the genetic repositories. This insidious corruption became known simply as the Blight. It was a biological sabotage of the highest order, designed to unravel the transhuman physiology from within. The Blight caused rapid organ degeneration in the implanted initiates, turning the very biological enhancements meant to make them immortal into a horrific death sentence. The infection tore through the reserves, destroying the Third Legion's remaining gene seed stock in its entirety. It was a silent massacre, carried out in sterile laboratories rather than on the muddy battlefields of the Unification Wars. The contrast with the rest of the Great Crusade was stark and humiliating. While the mighty hosts of the Ultramarines and the Lunar Wolves swelled to staggering numbers, easily exceeding 100,000 legionaries each, the Third Legion withered on the vine. Their numbers plummeted until only the 200 veterans who would eventually kneel before Fulgrim remained. The once proud banner of the Europa nobility was reduced to a handful of survivors, each bearing the standards of dead or drastically dwindled companies, standing as monuments to a stolen future. Even after Fulgrim's rediscovery and the stabilization of their genetic legacy using his pure, uncorrupted DNA, the shadow of the Selenar sabotage lingered permanently over the Emperor's children. The Legion survived the Blight, but they never truly recovered the momentum lost during those dark decades. While other legions conquered entire sectors and established vast, galaxy-spanning recruiting networks, the Third Legion was forced to spend crucial years slowly rebuilding their shattered ranks from the ground up. They remained among the smallest of the Legiones Astartes throughout the Great Crusade. This demographic fragility fostered a deep-seated psychological scar within the Legion. Their microscopic size in a galaxy of giants only intensified their obsessive drive. If they could not be the most numerous, they would be the most flawless, compensating for their lack of numbers with an absolute unyielding mastery of the art of war. The Blight had failed to extinguish them, but it had forever altered their soul, forging a desperate need to prove their worth to an Imperium that had nearly left them behind. This desperate need to prove their worth was not born solely from the trauma of the Blight. It was baked into the very heraldry they wore, a legacy of absolute sacrifice that predated their near extinction. Long before Fulgrim delivered his stirring address to the final 200 survivors, and just prior to the first mysterious losses of gene seed in transit to Luna, the Titan-hired Legion had already carved their devotion into the annals of the early Great Crusade. They had demonstrated that their loyalty to the Master of Mankind was not merely a matter of genetic programming, but a conscious, unyielding fanaticism. This defining moment of martial martyrdom took place on the world of Proxima. The compliance of Proxima was meant to be a triumph. The world had seemingly been brought into the Imperial fold, and a grand ceremony was convened in the planetary capital's central plaza to formalize the integration. The Emperor himself was in attendance, flanked by an honor guard of the 3rd Legion. Yet the submission of the Proximan leaders was a carefully orchestrated facade. Without warning, the ceremony shattered into sudden violence. Insurrectionists sprang an ambush of devastating scale, deploying forbidden archaeotech against the Imperial delegation. The cornerstone of their treachery was a vortex weapon, a terrifying device that tore a localized hole in reality itself, unleashing the annihilating, mutative energies of the warp directly into the crowded plaza. The sudden deployment of such a catastrophic weapon instantly threw the Imperial compliance force into disarray. The Emperor was caught in the immediate blast radius of the insurrectionist ambush, wounded by the esoteric energies unleashed in the surprise assault. In that critical fraction of a second, the 65th cohort of the 3rd Legion did not hesitate. Recognizing the existential threat to their creator, the legionaries threw themselves into the breach. Shoulder to shoulder with the golden warriors of the Legio Custodes, they formed a living ceramite shield around the Master of Mankind, absorbing the brunt of the traitorous fury. The fighting was apocalyptic in its intensity, a localized meat grinder of desperate close-quarters slaughter against the treacherous Proximan elite and their hidden arsenals. The 65th cohort held the line long enough for the Emperor to be secured, but the cost was absolute. Every single warrior of the cohort died in the defense of their sovereign. They were consumed by the raging energies of the vortex weapon and the overwhelming firepower of the ambushers. Fighting until the last bolter fell silent and the final Astartes was struck down, his armor breached and ruined. It was a display of unhesitating self-sacrifice that resonated deeply with the Emperor. The Iterator Legion had proven that they would gladly trade their entire existence to preserve his. Retribution was swift and merciless. For the crime of high treason and the attempted assassination of the Emperor, Proxima was condemned to death. The Emperor granted the surviving elements of the 3rd Legion the grim honor of executing this sentence. The Legion visited a merciless retribution upon the treacherous world, breaking its rebellion utterly and reducing the once proud planetary capital to smoldering ruin. The Proximan betrayal was drowned in unforgiving punishment, serving as a brutal, uncompromising warning. To any other world that might contemplate false compliance and raise a hand against the architect of the Imperium. Yet the true legacy of Proxima was not the ash left in its wake, but the unprecedented honor bestowed upon the 3rd Legion in the aftermath. In recognition of the 15th cohort's ultimate sacrifice, the Emperor granted the Legion a distinction held by no other force in the nascent Imperium. They were awarded the exclusive right to bear the Palatine Aquila, the Emperor's personal double-headed eagle standard, sculpted directly upon their chest armor. While other legions wore their own heraldry, simple Raptor Imperialis badges or standard Imperial eagles, only the Thired were permitted to wear the sovereign's personal crest as their own. This unparalleled honor fundamentally shaped the Legion's identity, when the Emperor formally bestowed the title of the Emperor's Children. Upon the surviving 200 Marines on Terra following the ravages of the Blight, the name was a reaffirmation of a bond already sealed in the blood of the 15th cohort. The Palatine Aquila became a heavy burden of expectation. To wear the Emperor's own symbol was to claim a standard of perfection that allowed for no failure, no retreat, and no flaw. It was a gleaming badge of supreme loyalty that they would carry into the stars, a constant reminder of the day they died to save the Emperor, and a standard that would make their eventual descent into darkness all the more tragic. The heavy burden of the Palatine Aquila demanded a doctrine to match its sovereign splendor. For a legion reduced to a mere 200 warriors, mere survival was entirely insufficient. They had to become the absolute pinnacle of the Adeptus Astartes. The genetic lineage of the Thyard Legion was already steeped in aristocratic pride, its earliest recruits having been drawn from the vanquished noble houses of Europa on Terra. These youths were originally given as tribute to the Emperor following their family's defeat in the Unification Wars, a noble sacrifice rumoured to be the very genesis of the name Emperor's Children. This aristocratic pedigree, combined with the lingering trauma of the gene seed Blight, created a martial culture desperate to prove its supreme worth. When Fulgrim addressed his shattered host on Terra, looking upon the 200 survivors who each bore the frayed banner of a dead or dwindled company, he did not offer them pity. Instead, he gave them a supreme mandate. He declared, "Only by imperfection can we fail him, we will not fail." Despite their renewed zeal and the sovereign crest upon their breastplates, 200 legionaries were far too few to wage an independent crusade across the unforgiving stars. Recognizing this stark logistical reality, the Master of Mankind placed the Emperor's Children under the command of Horus and his lunar wolves. For almost a century, until Horus was finally elevated to the exalted rank of War Master following the monumental triumph at Ullanor, the two legions fought as one intertwined host. This extended period of joint operations forged an unbreakable bond between Fulgrim and Horus, a brotherhood of shared blood and conquered worlds. Yet fighting continually in the formidable shadow of the lunar wolves only fueled the Thyard Legion's burning, obsessive desire to distinguish themselves as the true elite. To honor the name and the Aquila they bore, the Emperor's Children adopted a rigid creed taken directly from Fulgrim himself: the relentless, uncompromising pursuit of perfection in all deeds. This was not a mere philosophical aspiration, it was an absolute martial dogma. Tactical doctrines were studied, dissected, and refined in minute detail, and every stratagem was executed to the exact letter of the law. So absolute was their confidence in their flawless planning that the Legion developed the haughty, theatrical tradition of saluting their victories before a single shot was ever fired. This obsession with purity extended to their very biology and organization. The Emperor's Children employed no librarians within their ranks, as the psycho mutation was deemed a dangerous, unpredictable deviation. No such flaw would be tolerated in the Emperor's chosen sons. Fulgrim drove this pursuit of perfection to theatrical, almost reckless extremes. His formative years on Chemos, a resource-exhausted mining world locked in a perpetual grey twilight, where all art and leisure had been ruthlessly sacrificed for survival, had taught him that sheer, unyielding will could overcome impossible odds. He had risen from a mere factory worker to sole planetary ruler in 50 years. And he brought this same dramatic, world-shaping flair to the Great Crusade. He sought not merely victory, but magnificent spectacle. This was most vividly demonstrated during the compliance of Byzas. Driven by an overwhelming need to showcase his tactical supremacy, Fulgrim conquered the entire world, utilizing a strike force of only 7 men. It was a breathtaking display of martial brilliance that nearly cost the Primarch his life, yet it achieved exactly what he desired, immortalizing his strategic genius in the annals of the Imperium. However, the stunning conquest of Byzas also highlighted the growing shadow lurking behind the gleaming gold and purple ceramite of the Thyard Legion. Fulgrim was notably vainglorious, and his pride swelled exponentially in tandem with his expanding legend. The pursuit of perfection, initially born of a desperate, reverent need to honor the Emperor, gradually warped into an end unto itself. The Emperor's Children began to look down upon the rougher, less refined methods of their cousin legions, viewing them as crude instruments of war compared to their own artistry. Their flawless execution became a polished mirror in which they admired only their own reflection. In demanding absolute perfection, Fulgrim had inadvertently laid the foundation for an arrogance so profound that it would eventually blind them all to their own fatal vulnerabilities. While the stunning conquest of Byzas and the flawless doctrines of his legion fed Fulgrim's ever-swelling pride, this pursuit of absolute supremacy was not confined solely to the theatre of war. The master of the Emperor's children believed that a true paragon must excel in all endeavours, from the orchestration of a planetary compliance to the exacting strokes of a sculptor's chisel. Artistry was the truest expression of the perfection he desperately sought to embody. It was this arrogance, a radiant certainty in his own unparalleled skill, that led him into the subterranean vaults of Terra's Urals, seeking the legendary master smiths of Mount Narodnya. Within the cavernous expanse of the throne world's greatest forge, the Phoenician would find not merely an audience for his craftsmanship, but a true equal, a master whose skill rivaled his own. Beneath the soot-stained arches of Mount Narodnya, Fulgrim first encountered his brother, Ferrus Manus. The physical and philosophical contrast between the two Primarchs was absolute. Fulgrim stood as a vision of aristocratic elegance, his armor a gleaming testament to classical proportion and refined grace. Ferrus Manus, by stark comparison, was a creature of brutal pragmatism, a grim lord of heavy industry whose very hands were encased in living, liquid metal. Where the master of the Iterator legion saw creation as a sublime art to be perfected, the Lord of the Iron Hands viewed it as a mechanical equation to be solved with merciless efficiency. Yet beneath their diametrically opposed philosophies, both demigods shared an obsessive, uncompromising dedication to the ancient craft of the forge. It was Fulgrim's boundless pride that ignited the spark between them. Surveying the monumental utilitarian masterpieces of his newly discovered brother, Fulgrim openly boasted that he could forge the most perfect weapon ever made. Ferrus Manus, unaccustomed to such flamboyant declarations and fiercely proud of his own unmatched metallurgical prowess, met the boast with a direct challenge. Thus began a grueling smithing contest of truly mythic proportions, a trial of endurance and artistry that would silence the great forge complex for 3 unbroken months. For a full quarter of a standard year, the two Primarchs worked side by side in unceasing toil. Stripped of their regal finery, they laboured at adjacent anvils, bathed in the fierce actinic glare of the forge fires. The air of Mount Narodnya grew thick with the acrid scent of ozone and molten adamantium. Every thunderous strike of their massive hammers echoed like the beating of a planetary heart, ringing through the subterranean depths as they poured their superhuman will into the superheated metals. Fulgrim sought to capture the essence of devastating power wrapped in flawless aesthetic proportion. Ferrus Manus sought to bind the raw, untamed fury of the cosmos into an implement of unbreakable ruin. Neither Primarch spoke, neither rested, and neither allowed a single impurity to mar their respective creations. When the grueling 3 months had finally elapsed, the roaring furnaces were allowed to cool. The two brothers presented their finished masterpieces to the dim light of the forge. Fulgrim had created Forgebreaker, a magnificent thunderhammer of unprecedented power, its massive head etched with intricate filigree that beautifully belied the world-shattering kinetic force it contained. Ferrus Manus had forged Fireblade, an exquisite power sword wreathed in roaring golden flame, its edge honed to a monomolecular sharpness that could cleave through the heaviest armor with effortless grace. In a rare moment of absolute humility, both Primarchs were rendered speechless by the sheer magnitude of the other's craftsmanship. Each quietly recognized that his brother had achieved a level of breathtaking mastery he himself had not quite matched. Fulgrim declared the fire-wreathed sword the greater weapon, while Ferrus Manus proclaimed the thunderhammer the superior implement of war. In a profound gesture of mutual respect, they exchanged their creations without another word. Ferrus Manus took up the mighty haft of Forgebreaker, and Fulgrim accepted the blazing hilt of Fireblade. This simple, silent exchange at the forge sealed a profound bond of brotherhood that was widely said to be closer than that of any other two Primarchs in the nascent Imperium. They were opposites bound by a singular respect for perfection in creation. As their camaraderie blossomed, Fulgrim's aristocratic sensibilities frequently clashed with his brother's stark industrialism. The Phoenician would often tease the iron-handed Primarch for his total indifference to aesthetic beauty, a playful mockery that gave rise to Ferrus's enduring nickname, the Gorgon. Through the blistering fires of Mount Narodnia, they had forged not only legendary weapons, but an unbreakable oath of loyalty, standing together as twin pillars of martial and artisanal supremacy in the Emperor's Great Crusade. That unbreakable oath of loyalty and martial supremacy carried Fulgrim and the Emperor's children into the darkest reaches of the galaxy, driven ever onward by their unrelenting creed of perfection. The Third Legion did not simply wage war. They executed highly orchestrated symphonies of violence, where every bolter drill and flanking maneuver was a testament to their absolute superiority. Yet this noble pursuit of perfection was inextricably linked to Fulgrim's immense pride. The Phoenician could not abide the thought of a challenge that might defy his sons, nor a foe that could resist the Emperor's light for long. It was this towering arrogance that drew the Third Legion to the ocean world of Laer, a sphere of swirling azure storms and towering aquatic spires. The native inhabitants of this waterbound planet, the serpentine Laer, were a highly advanced and fiercely militant Xenos species. Their biotechnology and tactical acumen were so formidable that the strategos of the Imperial War Council delivered a grim assessment. The subjugation of the Laeran system would require a grueling, attritional campaign lasting no less than 10 years. To any other Primarch, such an estimate would be a sober tactical reality. To Fulgrim, it was an intolerable insult. His pride demanded that the Emperor's children prove the Imperial authorities wrong. He publicly vowed that his legion would scour the alien threat from the Laeran system, not in a decade, but in a single month. What followed was a campaign of breathtaking, almost reckless aggression. The Emperor's children descended upon the ocean world with a fury that married flawless tactical precision to a desperate, burning need for glory. They struck at the floating orbital platforms and submerged habitats of the serpentine Xenos, executing complex planetary assaults that pushed the Astartes to the very limits of their superhuman endurance. Fulgrim's sons fought with a singular obsession, driving themselves through exhaustion and grievous wounds to maintain the impossible timetable their Primarch had set. They achieved the impossible. The cleansing of Laeran was completed in one standard month, a staggering testament to the martial brilliance of the Third Legion. However, this breathtaking velocity exacted a heavy toll. 700 Space Marines lay dead, and over 4,200 were severely injured. For a legion that had once numbered only 200 warriors, such casualties were a significant blow. Yet in the intoxicating afterglow of their rapid conquest, the terrible cost was swept aside, justified as the necessary price of achieving absolute, undeniable perfection. The final climactic battle of the Compliance took place at the very heart of the alien civilization. Suspended above the churning, violent oceans of the planet was the central floating temple of the Laer. It was a sprawling, gravity-defying structure of iridescent curves and dizzying geometry, echoing with strange, atonal music and suffused with intoxicating, narcotic mists. What the Imperial forces did not realize was that the Serpentine Laer were not merely an advanced alien empire, they were devout, secret worshippers of Slaanesh, the Lord of Excess. Their grand temple was a nexus of warp-infused depravity, a cathedral dedicated to the pursuit of extreme sensation and carnal perfection. Fulgrim himself led the spearhead into the central floating temple, carving a path through the elite defenders of the Xenos species. Surrounded by the sensory overload of the alien fane, the blinding colors, the shrieking acoustics, and the cloying scents of alien incense, The Primarch fought his way into the deepest, most sacred sanctum. There, amidst the slaughtered bodies of the Laer priesthood, Fulgrim found a prize that captivated his artisan's soul. Resting upon a central dais was a magnificent weapon, a tall, exquisitely balanced silver sword, its pommel set with a single mesmerizing amethyst. Drawn by its flawless craftsmanship and the strange, resonant hum that seemed to emanate from the metal itself, Fulgrim reached out and claimed the weapon as a trophy of his peerless victory. He took up the silver blade of Laer, admiring its pristine edge and the elegant sweep of its silver guard, entirely unaware of the doom he had just invited into his soul. The sword was no mere Xenos artifact. It was a demon-haunted weapon, the physical vessel of a malevolent entity of Slaanesh. The moment the Primarch's armored gauntlet closed around the amethyst-set hilt, an invisible threshold was crossed. The daemon within the silver blade awakened, its dark consciousness brushing against the mind of the demigod. It did not strike with overt malice or terrifying visions. Instead, it offered soft, insidious whispers of praise. It spoke to his pride, to his desperate need for perfection, and to the subtle, unacknowledged insecurities that haunted his noble heart. On the storm-racked ocean world of Laeran, the true tragedy of the Third Legion was set into motion. The cleansing of Laeran would be recorded in the annals of the Great Crusade as one of Fulgrim's most brilliant victories, a masterpiece of rapid planetary compliance. In truth, it was the underlying cause of the whole Legion's fall. The whispers of the Silver Blade had begun, and with every battle to come, the demon-haunted sword would slowly, masterfully orchestrate the corruption of the Emperor's most perfect son. The insidious whispers that began in an alien temple found their ultimate devastating crescendo upon the black sands of Istvan. The corruption of the Third Legion had been a masterwork of gradual decay, orchestrated by a demonic intelligence that now steered the Emperor's most perfect son into the heart of open rebellion. In the fateful year of 006 M31, Horus unleashed his great betrayal, drawing the loyalist forces into a meticulously crafted annihilation on the desolate world of Istvan V. The Imperial retribution fleet arrived with righteous fury, completely unaware that the War Master had already poisoned half the forces sent to bring him to justice. The loyalist first wave descended into the Urgal Depression, a bleak and unforgiving expanse of obsidian rock and choking ash. Led by Ferrus Manus, Vulcan and Corvus Corax, the Iron Hands, Salamanders and Raven Guard struck the traitor lines with overwhelming force. They fought with the desperate valor of betrayed brothers, bleeding for every meter of ground. At immense cost, the three Primarchs and their battered legions secured the drop zone, pushing back the traitor vanguard and awaiting reinforcement so they could finally crush the rebellion. Salvation appeared to arrive as the massive dropships of the second wave darkened the sky. The Night Lords, Iron Warriors, Word-Bearers and Alpha Legion deployed their armored columns and thousands of legionaries along the ridge of the Urgal Depression. The exhausted Salamanders and Raven Guard looked up, expecting the covering fire of loyal brothers. Instead, a single red flare arced high into the ash-choked sky. It was the signal for the greatest treachery in Imperial history. The four newly arrived legions, secretly sworn to Horus, opened a relentless, point-blank bombardment upon the exposed loyalists in the landing zone. The Dropsite Massacre had begun. Trapped between Horus's entrenched forces and the treacherous second wave, the loyalists were subjected to an unmitigated slaughter. Amidst the apocalyptic crossfire, where demigods waded through a sea of shattered ceramite, the ultimate tragedy of the Third Legion unfolded. Fulgrim and Ferrus Manus, once the closest of brothers, found each other in the swirling vortex of destruction. Their meeting was a clash of broken vows and shattered ideals, steeped in a heartbreaking irony born decades prior beneath the Urals of terror. When the two Primarchs engaged in their final desperate duel, they did not wield the standard armaments of their station. Fulgrim swung the mighty Warhammer Forgebreaker, while Ferrus Manus struck with the reforged, fire-wreathed sword Fireblade. They were using the very weapons they had forged for one another at the dawn of their friendship. The physical manifestations of a brotherhood said to be closer than that of any other two Primarchs. The clash of demigods shook the Black Sands, each blow a repudiation of their shared past. They fought with apocalyptic fury, driving each other to the absolute brink, until the sheer violence of their conflict saw both legendary weapons struck from their hands and lost in the ash. Disarmed of the hammer his brother had made for him, Fulgrim drew the silver blade of Laer. The demon weapon sang in his grasp, its warp-infused edge cutting a blinding arc through the gloom. With a final, devastating parry, the Phoenician broke his brother's guard. Ferrus Manus, the indomitable Gorgon, was brought to his knees, utterly defeated and at the mercy of the Emperor's children Primarch. Fulgrim raised the silver sword high, prepared to deliver the killing blow. Yet as he looked down at the battered, defiant face of the brother he had loved above all others, the sheer horror of his actions pierced the demonic veil clouding his mind. For a fleeting, agonizing second, the corruption receded. Fulgrim saw the precipice upon which he stood. He saw the madness of the rebellion, the betrayal of his oaths, and the impending murder of his dearest friend. He hesitated. The pursuit of perfection, the arrogance and the warp-spawned delusions crumbled in the face of genuine love. Fulgrim found that he could not bring himself to strike. He could not kill Ferrus Manus. But the silver blade of Laer would not be denied its prize. Sensing the Primarch's sudden revulsion and failing resolve, the demon within the amethyst-hilted sword exerted its terrible will. It flooded Fulgrim's limbs with unnatural strength, overriding his conscious control. The Primarch screamed in silent, paralyzed horror as his own arms moved independently of his mind. The demon drove the blade downward in a flawless, unstoppable arc. The silver edge sheared through armor, bone, and flesh. Ferrus Manus was slain, his head struck from his shoulders by the brother who had desperately tried to spare him. In the wake of that catastrophic strike, Fulgrim's mind shattered. The grief and psychic trauma of the murder left him entirely defenseless against the entity that had orchestrated his downfall. The demon surged from the blade, possessing the Primarch body and soul. The creature that rose from the black sands of Istvan V was no longer the Emperor's perfect son, but a warp entity wearing his flesh, which soon presented the severed head of Ferrus Manus to Horus as a grisly trophy. The Dropsite Massacre effectively crippled 3 loyalist legions in a single day of unparalleled carnage. The slaughter was absolute, resulting in the recorded losses of over 200,000 legionaries killed in total. Each of the 3 legions lost more than 9/10 of its fighting strength, and of the Raven Guard, Corvus Corax led barely 3,000 survivors out of the slaughter. The Great Crusade was over, drowned in the blood of Istvan V, and the tragedy of the Emperor's children was complete. The ashes of Istvan V settled over a graveyard of shattered brotherhood. The Emperor's children, once the most radiant paragons of imperial virtue, departed the Black Sands, irrevocably damned. The demon that had seized control of their Primarch, following the murder of Ferrus Manus, steered the Third Legion deeper into the abyss. Their vaunted pursuit of perfection, a doctrine that had once saved their dying home world, transformed into an insatiable, ruinous hunger for sensation. The high culture, immaculate discipline, and flawless execution that had defined them were entirely consumed by the corrupting influence of the silver sword taken from the Laer temple. What began as an underlying cause of corruption on an ocean world had blossomed into total spiritual death. In the wake of the Dropsite Massacre, the Legion's tactical brilliance warped into supreme, blinding arrogance. That hubris already had its monument, the perfect fortress, an impregnable masterpiece of defensive architecture. That Fulgrim had raised in a strategically vital system back in the triumphant years of the Great Crusade, a towering testament to the Legion's absolute self-reliance. Now the monument became a grave. The surviving Raven Guard, utilizing the very tactical shadows the Emperor's children now proudly disdained, orchestrated a meticulous counterstroke, dangling detachments of the Imperial army before the walls as living bait. They lured the vainglorious garrison out from behind their unbreachable defences. Divorced from their fortifications by their own pride, the 3 legion defenders were isolated and destroyed entirely. The catastrophic loss of the perfect fortress demonstrated that the Emperor's children had sacrificed genuine martial excellence for obsessive, self-indulgent spectacle. The entity commanding Fulgrim's form, and eventually the corrupted soul of the Primarch himself, sought a destiny far beyond the mundane theatre of the Horus Heresy. The ultimate expression of perfection was no longer a flawless military campaign, but the transcendence of mortal limitations. To achieve this, Fulgrim enacted a grand and terrible betrayal against another of his own blood. He approached Perturabo, the master of siegecraft, and lured him into the churning warp storms of the Eye of Terror. Their destination was Idris, an ancient Eldari crone world steeped in psychic resonance. Fulgrim secured his brother's cooperation with a lie, promising to unearth an apocalyptic weapon known as the Angel Exterminatus. In truth, the journey was an elaborate sacrificial ritual. Upon the dead Eldar world, Fulgrim revealed his true design, utilizing a relic known as the Maugetar Stone to systematically drain Perturabo's life force. The stolen vitality of a Primarch was the immense fuel required to shatter the boundary between the material universe and the immaterium. Realizing the depth of the betrayal, the Lord of Iron retaliated with devastating fury. Perturabo brought his mighty thunderhammer down upon his brother. A desperate blow struck with enough kinetic force to utterly destroy Fulgrim's mortal shell. Yet the obliteration of his physical form was not a defeat. It was the final, necessary catalyst for his ascension. Flesh and ceramite dissolved into blinding, chaotic light as the warp flooded into the materium. Drawing upon the stolen power of his brother and the dark favor of his patron deity, Fulgrim was reborn. He rose from the ruins of his mortal body as a colossal, 4-armed serpentine Daemon Prince of Slaanesh. He was the first of the traitor Primarchs to achieve demonic apotheosis, shedding his humanity to become an eternal prince of excess. The tragedy of the Third Legion had reached its terminal point. The narrative arc that began with an infant Primarch scattered through the warp to a resource-exhausted mining world locked in perpetual twilight had concluded in the depths of the Eye of Terror. The boy who had lifted Chemos from starvation through absolute unyielding perfection had followed that same doctrine into the embrace of a dark god. The pristine, silver-haired demigod who had knelt without a word in his Spartan quarters to offer his sword to the Emperor, welcoming the battle-scarred dropships that descended from the grey sky, was gone forever. The Palatine Aquila, once the highest honour bestowed by the master of mankind upon the noble youths of Terra, was now worn by monsters who hunted for twisted pleasure. The Phoenician had fallen entirely, leaving behind only a slithering, 4-armed deity of ruin where the perfect sun had once stood.